So we'll start off with the definition of leadership here, and of course, leadership, like many other managerial concepts, is something that's incredibly complex, and so it almost is kind of silly at the end of the day to try to reduce something so complex to down to a simple definition, but we'll give it a go here. A leader is any person who influences individuals and groups within an organization, helps them establish goals, and guides them towards achievement of those goals so that they're effective. Okay, so you see the word that tends to appear here a lot is the word goals, and leaders do several things with goals, either establishing them or helping others establish them and then helping to achieve them. So now delving a little bit deeper into what some of the key elements of leadership are, there's three major ones. First is that you can't have leadership without a group. And we will talk later on in the course about something called self-leadership or self-driven leadership. And even in that case, where it sounds like you would just be leading yourself, it's really part of a larger group phenomenon that exists. So, really, if you don't have a group, you don't have too much of a need for leadership or any need for leadership. And then leadership implies you've got leaders and followers. Number two is goal-oriented, which means that, of course, we're leading you towards a goal. We just talked about that a second ago, so I think that's obvious by now. And then the third thing is that there is some kind of hierarchy within the group where there's leaders and followers. It doesn't necessarily mean that the leader is on top or even at the bottom or in the middle necessarily. They could be any one of those three places is the point. Okay, but there is some kind of established hierarchy. We're used to thinking of the leader being at the top, and what you're going to find out is that's not necessarily the case anymore, although frequently it still is. But the point is there is order in terms of the control of information, the control of decisions, the control of staffing, strategy, etc. And that's driven typically by the leadership. So leadership is one thing, effective leadership is completely another, and then a third thing, of course, is ineffective leadership. In this course, the common theme is going to be how do we drive effective leadership, how do we avoid ineffective leadership, and so it pays to start out with establishing what are the key elements of effective leadership. And you may, by the way, have some differing opinions as to what constitutes effective leadership, and perhaps you'll tell us that in your postings so we can further discuss your viewpoints. But for now, let's start off with a simple three bullet point way of looking at what constitutes effective leadership. One point of effective leadership is that the group achieves its goals, and so we expect to hit this sales target, we expect to close this many accounts, we expect to provide service to this many people in the community, etc. Would all be some concrete goals that the groups might achieve, and then there might be some more mundane things that are more internally focused that could be goals. But goals are aplenty. There's certainly no lack of goals that organizations set, whether they're broader or more narrow in context and direction. So if the group is achieving its goals, then the leadership is generally thought of as being effective, although we could, of course, come up with situations in which that was not the case. You can still have goal achievement within effective leadership, but that's a little bit more rare. Point number two is group cohesion, which means that group members are working well together. Okay, so good leadership, effective leadership means the leader has done certain things to ensure that people are working well together, the followers are working well together, and we'll talk about some of those things that leaders do in just a few slides here. But the main result is what we call group cohesion. You'll hear that term used throughout the course. Point three, the group is adapting well to external changes. Most organizations don't like to change. That's the bottom line. Most people don't like to change. So, organizations are run by people, and if people don't like to change, neither will organizations. And so a good leader is going to be an instrument useful in predicting and implementing, predicting, possibly analyzing, and then implementing change, okay, with their followers. And so the leadership is given credit for helping the organization adapt to changes that are typically not ones that they would otherwise make. In other words, something happens to you outside your organization, and you can't keep doing what you're doing, because if you do, you'll go out of business, or you'll file for bankruptcy, or you will just become so dysfunctional and ineffective that life will just get a lot tougher as far as getting things done. And so the leader steps in and says, "Nope, we got to do it this way now that the world is requiring this of us." So good leadership will help that process along. So now we investigate why is it that we even need leaders, and there are several reasons. This is not an exhaustive list before you here, but some interesting things to think about, certainly, as to why leadership is needed. And this goes beyond, by the way, what we discussed as, accomplishment of goals and keeping group cohesion. Of course, those are needs for leadership as well. Here are some others that I think are interesting. One, keeping of order. This is really an argument that you just need somebody in a certain position to make sure things flow smoothly. And so I kind of liken it to what I call the bike example. You have a bike, or just pick anything that is held together by screws and nuts and bolts and that kind of thing. But I'll choose to talk about a bike. And so, if you remove the screw and the nut and the bolt that holds the whole bike together, the bike falls apart, and then you can't ride it, and then you fall off of it, and that kind of thing. And so, leaders can be viewed as people who are just the nuts and bolts of keeping the organization together, without which, you would have a complete disaster on your hands. Things would fall apart. And what keeping order means in terms of leadership will vary depending on what situation we find ourselves in, what the issue of the day is, what the crisis of the day may be, etc. Point two, keeping focus on group goals. So what happens in just about every organization under the sun is that they set goals, then something happens to keep the organization from achieving those goals. And sometimes it's a minor thing, sometimes it's a big thing, and most of the time it's somewhere in between. But the point is that people can get wrapped up in getting very sidetracked from achievement of the original goal. And so the leader is there to remind the followers that, hey, this was the goal, and guess what? We're off track towards achieving that goal, and here's how we get back on track. So they keep people on task, so to speak. Point three, accomplishing complex tasks. Your followers just may not know how to do things because they are confusing, because there are many steps required, because they've never done them before, because it goes beyond their level of understanding and their skills and their knowledge. And and all this just relates to complexity. If things were so easy, we wouldn't need leaders, and we wouldn't need followers that thought for themselves and didn't need the leadership necessarily all the time to help them. So a leader will take a complex task and break it down into smaller, more digestible pieces that the followers can understand and implement. And so that is a role of leadership, or a need for leadership. That kind of goes along with point four, which is making sense of the world. Things happen. Employees or followers can't always decipher what's going on, and so neither can the leader, by the way. Sometimes the leader has no idea. They just know something happened, and it's either good or bad, but they can't explain why it's happening. But followers are going to look to leaders for those explanations, and so hopefully the leader can, in fact, provide an explanation or a set of explanations to describe what is happening and why it's happening. The last one's kind of an interesting thing to think about, very philosophical. but I like it. You know, it talks about leadership as a romantic ideal, kind of in the context of saying that do we really need leaders practically? Well, one opinion is no, but we need them on a more spiritual level, where people are seeking either a father figure or a savior figure to, you know, lift them out of the doldrums of the monotony and boredom and the complexity and the difficulty of their jobs. And so the leader is somebody who can do that. So we'll talk about, you know, this quality called charismatic leadership, which is, you know, coming from the word charisma, of course. And those tend to be the leaders, the ones, that is to say, who are charismatic, are the ones who tend to fulfill people's romantic ideals of what a leader should be. Okay, and not everybody, by the way, wants to be led by a charismatic leader, but we'll get into that later. So this notion of leadership is less practical and much more symbolic and philosophical, if you will, than the other bullet points you're seeing here. So if the goal is to have as much effective leadership as an organization can have, it would pay to know what are some of the drivers of ineffective leadership, or put another way, the title of the slide, what are some obstacles to effective leadership? So let's kind of go through piece by piece here what some of these are, and I'll just start out by saying that, you know, you can have a counter argument for each of these bullet points here, that they actually, in some cases, could lead to effective leadership as opposed to ineffective leadership. So I'll try to take both sides of the coin here as I go through each bullet point. So the first is environmental uncertainty. Typically, this is a barrier to effective leadership because people tend to lack trust in leaders when there is environmental uncertainty. Because, you know, the leader can say and do one thing, and then the environment changes, whether it's the internal or external environment, and the leader's comments, actions, etc., suddenly are invalidated by that change. Okay, and you know, it's kind of the old the flip-flopping politician kind of thing, where people don't trust politicians who change their positions. And if people would actually sit down and think about it some of the time and say, hey, you know what, the politician changed his or her position because the environment changed, then that would be an indication of a good leader, as opposed to, you know, somebody who's just fickle. But anyway, the public doesn't tend to think that way, and it's a problem for politicians, and it will probably always be. Now, on the flip side of the coin here, environmental uncertainty in some situations can lead to leaders being more effective because of the, you know, the tumult in the environment. Your followers are now more receptive to being led because the leader can try to set things straight in this world of uncertainty. Okay, so it's not always going to be the case that this will happen. It's maybe 25 to 30% of the time, somewhere in that range. But we're going to look at models that actually dictate when environmental uncertainties yield better leadership effectiveness results than if the environment were less certain. Organizational rigidity, bullet point number 2 here. You know, so really, you know, another word for this is bureaucracy. What's bureaucracy? It's layers of approvals and processes and, you know, things that corporations and public organizations do to basically delay decision making until everybody has had a say and has signed off. And so bureaucracy is often thought of as a negative, although there are countervailing reasons why sometimes bureaucracy is not such a bad thing, and it really just comes down to everybody being informed and having buy-in to whatever is happening with that organization at the moment. But anyway, that's another topic of discussion. The point here is that when the organization is rigid, meaning it has these rules and procedures and we have to stick to them, what good is really a leader? Because the leader is there to, A, get rid of a lot of that, or at least minimize the burden associated with that bureaucracy. And 2, there's a set system of rules, and so what value does the leader really add when employees have to do what the rules tell them to do and what the processes tell them to do? Okay, so this can wind up being ineffective for leaders, or an ineffective situation for leaders who want to provide leadership. By the same token, again, here's the flip side of the argument is, if I'm a good leader who knows how to play by the rules and use those rules to my advantage, then I can use the bureaucracy to accomplish what I need. And so you're leveraging a system that's already in place, essentially, is what I'm saying here. Again, you could debate with me whether that's, at the end of the day, effective leadership or just doing, what would come naturally and what is logical to do in the situation, which is not always, by the way, the best leadership stance to take, but in some cases it's the most efficient, and so efficient can be correlated with effective leadership. Bullet point 3, falling back on old ideas and simplistic solutions, kind of ties into what I was just saying. Why this is generally perceived to be ineffective leadership or a barrier to effective leadership is because leaders are supposed to make organizations better, more efficient, more high quality in terms of the services that they provide or the products they produce, the people they serve. And then there's the whole, internal organization. How do we make people's jobs better? How do we make them happier, more satisfied? And so if we're not thinking about changing the system in places that it needs to be changed, then we're falling back on old ideas, and we're making decisions based on rules that are sometimes archaic or dysfunctional, or that were designed to serve another purpose that no longer exists within our organization. So therefore, this can be thought of as ineffective leadership. Now, I'm not going to tell you that 100% of the time it's a stupid idea to fall back on old ideas. Sometimes that's what you want to do. Is just, do exactly what we did before, because the situation is the same, the decision framework is the same, and so why do we have to reinvent the wheel as to what the framework for decision is here? It wouldn't make any sense. So again, 3 is in some ways a little bit controversial, or one could make arguments that bullet point 3 again is effective or ineffective leadership. Bullet point 4, established organizational culture. Cultures are very hard to change. Very, very hard to change. Why? Because they grow over time. They involve a lot of people, essentially everybody in the organization, and they become habit. And what a culture does is it dictates the way things do and don't get done within an organization and the kinds of decisions the organization is going to make. And so the leader often will come into an organization and be at odds with that culture, because the culture wants to do one thing and the leader wants to do something else. And oftentimes the leader was put in place to change the culture, of course. So the culture can work against you in that regard. But, of course, again, if the culture is consistent with what the leader's style is and what the leader's orientation is, then the established culture is going to work in favor of the leader being able to provide effective leadership. So again, that one is somewhat controversial as well. The last one is something that academics would say, but practitioners wouldn't. Meaning, if you're a leader and you're working for a nonprofit or a public organization, and you would probably talk about the first 4 things as being obstacles, but you wouldn't necessarily mention research, because most people in management or administrative positions don't actually read the research. And lucky for you, you're taking this course and you're going to get a big exposure to all the different research theories and models and applications starting right here and now. But if leaders would actually take the time to sort through these models that have a lot of thinking put in behind them, and a lot of testing, models become published because there is data to back up the fact that the assertions that these models are making. So this week we'll even take a look at about, I think, 5 or 6 different models. these are not just flighty theories that somebody dreamed up while they were in the shower. Again, these were ideas that were worked on based on a lot of observation in the working environments, and then testing the theories and models with real-time data to see if the models and theories were valid. And so the point here being that leaders will not access these results and use them to their benefit in managerial situations, which is unfortunate, but of course you're going to be the ones to buck the trend here. An age-old question in leadership courses like this one and org management courses that you've taken is, what is the difference between management and leadership? Some would say there is no difference. Others would say there's a distinct difference. And a third camp would say there is some overlap between the two, but there still are differences. We're gonna take the tact here that management is different from leadership. And the main distinction between the two is that leadership or leaders focus more on change, and managers focus more on implementation of a blueprint that they got from leaders. Okay, and that kind of drives the rest of the bullet points you see here, where managers focus on the here and now. Leaders are always forward-looking and trying to create plans for the future. Which means that they are creating change rather than the managers who are trying to keep the organization on track and accomplishing whatever the blueprint was that the leader created, or leadership created. Maintaining versus creating new culture kind of serves the same purpose. Whereas the next bullet point down there, remaining aloof, is what managers do. Aloof means, you are not really getting in touch with your subordinates or your followers. You're just checking to see whether they met the plan objectives or not. Whereas the leader creates the emotional bond with the followers and really kind of gets under their skin in good ways and bad, to motivate them, to keep them from doing certain things, and to really just get the best productivity out of them, and also keep them as happy as possible. Whereas a manager is not really so much into that. A manager, again, is just more of a check the box kind of a person or employee who is making sure things get done. Some would say, babysitting. Maybe that's too much of a simplistic notion, but the idea is making sure things are running as smoothly as possible. The last bullet point contrast, position power versus personal power, we're going to come back to later on in the course when we talk about the different kinds of power. And just, the quick preview there is that position power is much weaker than personal power. And so a good leader, first of all, has a good amount of personal power, meaning people just like the leader and do what the leader says because they like the leader and the person that is the leader. So, managers say, hey, I'm the manager, somebody put me in this spot, and so therefore you kind of have to do what I say. And, nobody really tends to use those words, but effectively that's what's going on when you make requests of your followers, whichever way you phrase them and how you implement them. You're basically asking people to do something, and hopefully they do it. But anyway, my point here is leaders use a different dynamic of their power, which is their personal power, versus managers who fall back on the fact that, hey, the organization put me in this position because it needed something done, and so therefore I'm going to use my position power to persuade you to act in a certain way. Different power dynamic going on there between leaders and managers. So this is an interesting slide on the gender differences in managerial styles. And I guess you could extend this as well to leadership styles, because we just made the distinction between management and leadership, and we took the tack that they're really two separate but often overlapping dynamics in an organization. But here we're focusing on how do males do things differently than females when it comes to managing their people. And there are some similarities and then mostly differences here in this list, which I'm not going to really talk about to any great extent. I think this is one of these slides that is nice information to know, and it's important because whether you are the leader, the manager, or the follower, it's just good to understand the dynamic between you and your boss or subordinates to appreciate each other's backgrounds. But there's also a danger in overgeneralizing, that every single female manager acts this way and every single male manager acts this way. It's not necessarily true, but it's a general trend. So first contrast, men tend to work at an unrelenting pace, where female managers don't work at an unrelenting pace. It's more of a steady pace, and they insert breaks, whereas males don't tend to take as much in the way of breaks. Males tend to perceive breaks that are not self-initiated as interruptions, and female managers think the opposite. They're not interruptions. So, like, for instance, when a subordinate comes up and says, "Hey, I'm having a problem with X," the male manager, who will probably still help the subordinate, tends to think, "Hey, interruption, taking time away from my managerial responsibilities." The female manager, according to the research, I should say, by the way, this is all research-driven. This is not sexist opinion and conjecture. This is what the research turned up. So, you may like the findings, you may dislike them. This is, again, objectively researched and with scientific rigor and reported. Anyway, back on the interruptions, the female managers don't see these things as interruptions. They see them as part of the job and necessary in bettering the organization. Males tend to schedule less time for communication. Females tend to schedule more time. I've personally seen that. I've worked for men, I've worked for women, and I will tell you that the female managers I had were much more into longer conferencing times and discussion times and meeting times. So my personal experience has certainly confirmed that. Males tend to stay focused on work and don't have as many non-work activities. Females do the opposite and have more non-work activities. And so therefore, males tend to feel a little bit more isolated than females do, who feel more connected to others as a function of their varied interactions. And that ties into the next piece, which is identity. Here in the United States, in general, we have a high work-personal identity relationship, meaning that we tend to think of ourselves with reference to what we do. In other words, I am a doctor, I am a lawyer, I am a manager, I am a whatever, okay? As opposed to, I'm a generous person who likes to go skydiving or something like that, which has nothing to do with work. We tend to think of ourselves within the context and framework of what do I do for a living. And it makes sense because we all spend a lot of time at jobs and work and career. And so it makes sense that really drives our personality and modus operandi, etc. But there's a gender difference here, which is that males tend to do this to a greater extent than females, who tend to have the more multifaceted identities. I am a manager, I am a spouse, I am a mother, I am a whatever. Both genders prefer face-to-face contact, so no differences there, and both believe in having complex networks to help both themselves succeed and help others succeed, and of course their organizations to succeed. So the question here is, how do leaders shape culture? And I got done saying a few slides ago that occasionally leaders do not shape culture because the culture is so strong and so entrenched within the organization that there's very little that the leader can do. And this tends to, again, happen when a new leader is brought in from outside the organization, somebody who doesn't know the culture, but they're brought in to change the culture. and there's typically going to be a clash where one of two is going to win. Either the leader is going to win, or the established culture is going to win, and who knows which it is going to be. Now, assuming that the leader can shape culture, how does he or she do it? Four main ways here. Some are more tactical and lower level than others, which are more strategic and higher level. So let's go through them piece by piece. Role modeling is your first piece here, and the leader literally acts and behaves in a way that they expect the followers to act and behave. So I'll give you a great example from my corporate experience. I remember we were needing to cut down on the costs of travel at a company that I worked for. And this was a big organization that spent billions of dollars a year on advertising and travel and R&D and that kind of thing, and our sales were dropping, so we had to find some cost cuts, and one of the major areas of cost cutting was travel, because managers were taking trips to all these places all over the world and staying in the best hotels, and instead of taking the cab, they would take the limo, that kind of thing. So after the accountants analyzed it, they said, hey, we could save a lot of money just by cutting back on travel. So what the CEO did was he put together, I think it was a videotape at the time, this was back in the mid-90s, of all the ways in which he cut back on his travel expenses. Okay, and so you would expect, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company to travel lavishly, first class, limo pickup at the airport, dine in the finest restaurants, stay in the best hotels. And so what he did is he showed how he flew in coach, and then how he took the taxi cab instead of the limo, how he ate at a moderately priced restaurant as opposed to something you might find in the Ritz-Carlton, etc., etc. And then employees followed suit, because if the CEO can act that way, then so can I. Okay, and that's one example of role modeling. But there are countless other ways in which leaders can role model organizational processes that they expect that they expect the followers to also do. Point number 2, reward system. So how I compensate people. Okay, and that can sometimes come down to how I set up salary structures, how I differentiate them amongst the different positions and responsibilities. It's there's two pieces here. There's setting up a system, and then there's actually implementing the system, where I decide who gets the bonus, who doesn't, who gets the raise and the promotion, who doesn't. So it's two pieces. One is setting up the right system that's going to work, and then 2 is actually making the choices within the system as the year and time progresses. A third point here is just who you hire. Most leaders will tend to hire, where they have a choice, of course, will tend to hire those who are most similar to them, because it helps them more easily shape the culture of the organization. Okay, and this is, by the way, not always such a great decision, because you need diversity in terms of thought and approaches in your top management team and your middle management team. So hiring, you times 30 is not always a terribly bright idea, because then, you'll have cohesion, you'll have easy decisions being made, but they won't necessarily be the right decisions or decisions that are beneficial for the long-term viability of the organization. But anyway, the leader can affect culture through who they hire, whether similar or dissimilar to them. And the last piece is just how the strategies you undertake, that you convince your organization to undertake, and how you structure the reporting relationships, which is not a topic we're going to look at in this course, because you've looked at it already in org management. But just understand that it, of course, does shape culture, because the more you connect people or disconnect them, the more you drive your culture through that structure, or don't drive your culture through that structure, because there are the disconnections. Okay, and that comes down to literally who reports to who, how often, and in what format. And there's different kinds of formats out there, like the matrix reporting and the direct reporting, which again we won't cover in this course. So the next two slides deal with the issue of whether leadership really matters to organizations, and it would behoove us to get a good grounding on both sides of the arguments here, so that we at least walk away with some justification for wanting to learn to become better leaders. Because, if leadership doesn't really matter, what's the point in learning how to become a good leader? So we need to hear the arguments and the counter-arguments as to why leadership is significant. So we start with the dark side here, which is, what are the reasons some think leadership does not matter or is insignificant? The first one is that environment drives organizational performance rather than leadership. This argument is often made in the context of presidents of the United States. Okay, so let's think back to good presidents and bad presidents, whatever your political opinions are. There's presidents who have been generally regarded as being effective, and then others who have been generally regarded as being ineffective. So President Clinton, Ronald Reagan, effective presidents. Probably both of the Bushes, ineffective. Barack Obama, we'll see. There's still some differences of opinion on him right now. But lately, he's doing pretty good. Anyway, the point is that, the times make the president rather than the president making the times, which is analogous to environment being more important than the leader. So, I don't really personally believe this. I think that, a leader can be dealt a bad environment and he or she can make the best or worst of that environment, and that's what distinguishes the good leader from the bad leader. So the leadership is always important to me or significant to me, even if the environment overtakes the fact that leaders can be less effective, the environment makes the leaders less effective than they could otherwise be if the environment was more beneficial to the leadership. Culture we've already discussed as a really strong force that can work for or against the leader, so I'm not going to belabor that one. The third bullet point, there's a lot of studies out there that try to prove one thing or another, and you can't always just rely on the results of one study and say, hey, it's a foregone conclusion that what this study says is reality. But in this case here, we have one study that points to the assertion that leadership is a very small percentage of the variables that explain organizational performance, something around 10%, which is not much, okay? Which means, the flip side of which means that 90% of performance is explained by something else besides leadership. Bullet point 5, leaders having little discretion. There is a lot of truth to that. I've seen that personally in my career, where boards of directors will basically tell the CEOs and the COOs and the CFOs what they need to do, or at least strongly suggest that they do it, which means that if they don't do it, then they won't have a job for much longer, or there's going to be, some conflict and tumult going on with the relationship between the board and the top management team. So, in certain situations, it could be argued that the top management leaders are just there to carry out the wishes of the board, and that's a totally valid argument. Last bullet point, we talked about leadership as being a romantic myth. Again, this is, whether you really believe in leadership as something that gets things done, or whether it's more of one of these things that is just going to make me feel better. But even just feeling better because of the presence of the leader can get you motivated to work and be productive and accomplish organizational goals. So in and of itself, there is a beneficial effect of having the leader being the romantic savior kind of person. Okay, so that's my opinion on that one quickly. So now the flip side of the argument, which is that leaders or leadership does matter, which I tend to agree with, and that's why I teach the course and why I get excited about the material and why I use it in my own leadership. practices, because I think leadership does matter, and I have a sneaking feeling you probably do too, but if you don't, we'll probably hear about it on your posting this week, yeah? So I'm going to skip down to bullet point 2. Leaders provide vision and direction. Okay, no matter what the environmental circumstances are, a leader has to step up with a vision and direction for the organization that responds to that environment. And so who else but the leader can do that? Really nobody else. Okay, and so that in and of itself is something that matters and that is important to organizational performance. Leaders orchestrate change, bullet point 3. We've talked about how leaders are different than managers. Leaders drive change. Managers implement the change or keep the organizations focused on the change steps. But without the leader, you can't get the change detailed and in process and get people motivated about it. Again, I told you before, studies are tricky because every time you have a concrete finding, you'll find a conflicting finding that disconfirms the original finding. And here's another case in point that says leadership accounts for about half of performance. The slide before this, leadership was something like 10% of performance. Now you're telling me it's half. Well, yeah. Again, studies conflict, and so who do we believe? Well, I tend to believe this study more than I do the other one. But the point is that different environments, different circumstances, leadership is going to have a differential effect. That is to say, there are some situations in which leadership is more significant or more important or more beneficial, assuming it's good leadership, and in other cases in which the leadership is just not as useful or useful at all. And that's okay, and that's the way life goes. We have to accept that fact, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't at least try. The first bullet point here, circling back to the top of the slide, acknowledges that leadership is important, but that there are other things like culture, like environment, like the board of directors, etc., who also dictate the outcomes of organizational performance. I'll conclude narration in Chapter 1 with a focus on this slide. The next 2 slides won't be narrated because they're just a list of facts that demonstrate 2 or 3 of the points that we're making here in this slide. This slide is about what are the factors that are fueling change in the global workplace, that are fueling the change for, the need for change in leadership. Okay, so let's kind of start at the bottom and work our way around the circle here. Employee expectations are changing. Probably the major change here is the shift from viewing leaders as all-important, all-knowing, top-of-the-hierarchy kinds of people to people who are simply there to serve the followership and remove obstacles from their accomplishment paths. Okay, and so this is a really, really big step change in thinking, where we used to think the leader knew it all, could do everything, could bark a lot of orders out to people, and now we're thinking leaders are just there to help empower employees, because employees nowadays want to be empowered. They want to have the power. They want to make the decisions. They want to enrich themselves with the training and the knowledge so that they can move forward in the organization. And so the leader is just there to help them do that. There are other expectations that have changed, but that's a main one that I want to focus on here for starters. Demographic changes and increased globalization. I'll kind of lump the 2 pieces there together. There are many, and I'm going to let you take a look at the next 2 slides that show you what's going on both here in the United States and also in the world as far as how demographics, ethnicities, races, ages, etc. are changing in the workforce, and that dictates needs for different kinds of leaders and leadership. So for instance, just to throw out a quick example, the way you manage Generation X people is going to differ from the way you manage Generation Y, which differs from the way you manage baby boomers, etc. And we'll get into those details later on in the course. Worldwide political changes is a big topic, which we could spend a whole course on, but the main point here is that you have to be sensitive to how countries change their governments, which regimes are in power, because that dictates then the kinds of leadership that are acceptable within those kinds of countries as the cultures within the countries change. So look at the Middle East now. There's a lot of unrest. Countries are democratizing. Take Egypt, for example, and so a more democratic or participative form of leadership, we'll talk about what that means pretty soon, is probably going to be a lot more called for in those kinds of cultures and countries than it ever was.